Welcome to the Legal Selva podcast.
Delphine, when did you first go to Burma?
I first went to Burma, I believe, in May 2008. I had been sent, at the time I was on staff at the Washington Post, and I was a very low-rung editor / reporter between the foreign desk and copy editing around the newspaper. And a massive cyclone hit Burma that reports were quickly coming out that about 140,000 people had been killed in a massive tsunami as a result of this tropical storm. And it was, as far as we knew, the biggest natural disaster and the most lethal natural disaster in the world since the Asian tsunami in 2004, which had killed millions of people. And I say this because we weren't actually sure, because at the time the ruling military junta in Burma was not letting any reporters in, so there was very little news coming out. And the Washington Post had no Southeast Asia correspondent anymore. They couldn't get anyone in who was well known as a reporter in the region. And I was asked to go cover that as a rookie journalist. So that was what sent me there.
So it was your first sort of, I don't know, like out of desk, a term, like your first, what do you call it when you like go to a place like on site?
Overseas assignment? Dispatch?
Overseas assignment?
I guess it. Yeah, like dream come true in my case. I had been kind of bluffing editors saying I was they had no one in West Africa anymore either. They used to have desks staffed around the world, as most newspapers did. You know, they used to cover the world. And of course, because of massive industrial collapse in journalism that continues to this day, there had been a retrenchment. And because I am half French and speak French and was always curious about Africa, I thought I'd go and just settle down in West Africa and be their reporter there. So I was kind of, so the foreign editor phoned me up like a couple of weeks after the cyclone hit, and he said to me, look, we know you want to go to West Africa, but would you be interested in going to this country, Burma, Myanmar, which has two names, which I'm sure we'll get into.
Yeah.
And then I sort of shiveringly said, sure. But the first thing I had to do was try to get a visa, because as I said, this was a time when foreign journalists were not allowed in the country. They are not again now. So I had to go to the Washington embassy and sort of and give my work history. And strangely enough, they weren't about to Google me and see that I was clearly on staff at a newspaper. But I managed to get a visa, and with my heart beating through my chest, like 5 days later or something, showed up in
Did you know you were staying? Did you? I imagine you can't just go to an ATM there and take out money, correct?
Correct. Well, the situation has changed radically in recent years, up and down and crazy. And at the time, I couldn't even place this country on a map when I was told to go there. I mean, literally, it's with no offense to the Burmese, it's not a very well-known. So the British, because George Orwell read a famous book called Burmese Days, and it has a certain romantic aura because at the time its democracy icon Aung San Suu Kyi had been under house arrest for going on like 21 years at that time. And she had won a Nobel Peace Prize and famously very beautiful and spoke a beautiful English because she'd lived most of her life in exile in England. So one had heard of this, and about 8 months before, there had been a suppressed revolution there that, again, we got very little news about, that was very visually striking because it was thousands of Buddhist monks in their beautiful saffron toga robes who were marching and calling for metta, for loving kindness, and were cracked down on very viciously by the Burmese junta. And it seemed to be a moment, like, all of these moments of these little spring uprisings. This is 2007. So we're talking a few months later, this massive cyclone hits, and this bizarre closed country with its democracy leader in prison, a sort of North Korea, not quite as repressive as North Korea, but sort of on that level, a country that had once been the jewel of Southeast Asia, tucked, I just mentioned to listeners who don't know, as why should they? Burma is this massive kite-shaped country that is surrounded, borders China, India, a little bit of Bangladesh, Thailand, Laos, and then the Andaman Sea, so towards the Indian Ocean. But sort of very little known. So anyway, the very long-winded answer, I was only meant to go and get this cyclone story because, again, as I was saying, I was a very junior on a desk full of newsroom stuffed with Pulitzer Prize winners and great foreign correspondents. And the war was still going on in Iraq and Afghanistan. So sort of more hardcore journalists were covering war that involved US soldiers. So I was sort of sent to cover this bizarre story months after this awful but tragically undercovered revolution, just to go in and get the story. That was my marching orders from the editors when they pulled me in were go and get the story. Now, you asked about money. So I scrambled in those 5 days, aside from just locating this country on the map, of course, is to talk to as many people as I possibly could who knew about Burma. I asked the senior foreign correspondent at the time, what do I do? What do you do when you sort of parachute into a country and you've got to get to the story, knowing that various foreign correspondents had already publicly, the minute they were recognized from BBC or the New York Times or other places, they were either frog marched straight from the airport back onto a plane, or they were kicked out, or they were writing with no byline, meaning without their name printed, so that they could get to these kind of, because we were talking about a sort of dictatorship that also was economically completely shut down and had been for years. So one correspondent told me, no, just ask the Post to give you, cash. So I effectively went in, and at the time the Post had a bit more money than it has had in recent years for such things. But I went in with $10,000 of crisp bills on my tucked all over my body, inside my shoes and belts, and hoped I wouldn't be stopped. But it was cash that I carried on me because I knew I wouldn't be able to get any. And I was also told that the minute you get there, no one accepts dirty dollar bills. They only accept perfect ones, which of course was very hard at the time, as being Washington DC to find. So that was the beginning.
Oh my gosh! So you weren't supposed to be there. Were foreign journalists were allowed in, or they weren't allowed in?
No, they were not allowed in. There were about 3 permanent sort of wires reporters, as they're called. Someone who worked for Reuters, who worked for the AP, they were Burmese, and then you have a few humanitarian organizations that had been there for years. But the journalists who were going in to cover what was going on effectively had to do so. There are very few countries in the world that were doing this. I think Iran at one point, North Korea certainly, Burma was one of them, where people would go in and not use their name, because if you did, it wasn't just that you were at risk, and I really wasn't much at risk as a foreigner. It was that the people you talked to could be tracked down by spies of the government, intelligence, because there was a rule at the time. There were many rules. There was absolutely no freedom of assembly in more than 5 people, no freedom of speech, obviously. And the idea of talking to a foreigner was sort of engaging in politics. So one of the pieces of advice I was given for people who knew Burma very well, they're like, whatever you do, avoid people who want to talk to you because maybe they're a government agent, which was, for me, very confusing, because I had to immediately get quotes, figure out what was going on, or not confusing, but, I kind of had to maneuver around that because, of course, I needed to talk to people who were willing to talk to me without being overtly direct to them and saying, hi, I'm from the Washington Post, which is normally exactly what you're meant to do as a journalist. And the ethical code of decent journalism is you don't lie about who you are. You immediately admit, hi, I'm, so people know what they're up against. Otherwise, you're deceiving them. But I quickly figured that out, insofar as, in a country like that, where people, you're not going to immediately say, oh, what do you think of your government? And then they're slapped in the gulag. And there really is a system of concentration camps and prisons around the country. I figured out very quickly that if I could say something like, wow, your country's so beautiful, but it's so poor, then that would invite them to answer. And it happened every time. Yes, but my government destroyed the country. And then they would go off into a political rant. And then I knew I was talking to someone who would be and I would say to them immediately, I'm here for a newspaper, for an American newspaper. And then I could be honest with the individuals I was talking to. So it was a really interesting exercise in telling people who I was, but ensuring that they were in a safe space to begin with, such that they could feel confident talking to me, knowing that I wouldn't use their name either. I would be able to hide their identity.
Like you're like a real life spy.
Right, yeah. Well, the danger with being a foreign correspondent is that, as we know, that because they're like, Evan Gershkovich at the moment is in prison in Russia, often journalists are accused of being spies. And that's why it's critical that, in this day and age of journalism being deeply mistrusted for very good reason and for maybe less good reasons, it's really important that, journalists adhere to certain ethical codes, in part because you're not a spy. But you are effectively, because you're dealing with work and information that ultimately you put in the public domain. But you can very often be accused of working for various governments. But yes, what was amazing about going is 2008, and I was sort of doing all the. This is a time, in Burma at the time, people didn't really have access to, despite being in Southeast Asia and the height of amazing technology, it was extremely expensive because the junta was deliberately preventing communication between people, extremely expensive to get hold of a cell phone. There was no use cell phone. There was like one cell phone service controlled by the government's cronies, the military government's cronies, effectively, so they could monitor people on telephones and online as well. That people in the cities who had access to the internet, possibly they were monitoring everything. So it was also an exercise of sort of real old school reporting, like being thrown back to a few decades before. All I had was a pen and paper and a notepad. And that first trip, I should say, I only went for a very first trip of like 3 weeks. I was only supposed to go for a few days, but I ended up staying longer. I didn't even have a something to record people because, again, I didn't want to get them in trouble, and I wasn't sure on my way out if my stuff would be seized. And I had to, yeah. No, go on.
No, I imagine what did you say you had here? Like 63 notebooks, so like thousands and thousands of pages.
Eventually, because what ended up happening is
if they search your suitcases.
Yeah. Well, I am naturally a very disorganized person, as you can probably hear from the way I talk. I have a very disorganized way of thinking, which is very useful in those situations because I have my own system of organization that good luck to anyone who actually tries to read my handwriting. I can't even read my own handwriting. But yeah, but I would take furious notes at the time, very carefully. But then, yes, when I would leave the country, because I ended up going, I don't know how many trips I ended up taking, 6 or 7 over 5 years, when I eventually would stay much, much longer amounts of time. I was very careful to not write down, full names and addresses and things that you would want. But, eventually I would send myself stuff and immediately upload it on a computer, send it out of the country via. That first trip, I think I was staying in a hotel where the UN had offices, like on the 5th floor or something, and I was on the 4th floor, and they had satellite phones, which means they could evade the internet that the government used. So I would use that to file my first 1 or 2 stories. I ended up writing the rest and filing them from Bangkok afterwards.
Right.
And I had even my editor in Washington, who had been a Southeast Asia correspondent, was just brilliant. I was so lucky to have the adults in the room, as it were, who were on the other end. He had a fake email account, so we were writing to each other. I'd write things like, "Dear Uncle, I'm seeing a lot of anger." Sort of. I was playing because I was far less of a young woman now. I was like a young 20-something, so I could get away. As a young woman, I'd been underestimated and kind of play at being this kind of clueless tourist who shows up in this disaster zone. Of course, I was the only tourist in the entire country at that time, aside from Save the Children, Médecins Sans Frontières, and a few other foreigners who managed to get in.
So control the internet. I have some understanding. So I've actually been to North Korea. Really odd, and it was a very controlled trip. We only got to stay for about 5 days.
Whoa, that's way more dangerous, actually.
It's really funny. You said 2008. I went to North Korea the end of 2007, let's say September-ish, September, October 2007. I was working in South Korea at the time, and they started this program, I'm assuming to make money, where any sort of Canadian, American, British English teacher who was on a work visa in South Korea could go to North Korea for, I think it was 5 days, and it was a controlled trip. You got on the bus and then you did exactly what they told you to do. We got a big list of things we can't bring, t-shirts with logos on them or magazines or absolutely anything. But I remember being there and you go across the border into North Korea and the South Korean border is gorgeous. It's this brand new building at the time. And the North Korean border is a tent that looks like MASH. Okay. And you take off you put your suitcases on the little conveyor belt, and these like 12-year-olds with rifles open them up and start going through them. But I remember looking at, like, you know, at the time, you're like, this is a massive gun. Like, you're 12 might be an exaggeration, but, you know, 14, 16 years old, little Korean boys. But like, these guns didn't look, I guess from reading to me like police novels or whatever, these guns didn't look new or well cared for or anything. So I remember thinking, I was like, there's so many people here. If they just said, no, all of a sudden, and together, we're not listening, we're going to revolt, I think the people would have won. But in talking to some of the people who worked at the hotels and that, like, the mindset of them was, no, what? No, we live here. Our country is very wonderful. We're like, like brainwashing, you know, or at least that's what they said to us. And I'm guessing that they were probably just as nervous. No, we don't say anything to the foreigner, because if we get found out, I don't know, we die, we go to jail. Like, I have no idea what their consequences would have been. But in terms of like military presence, it didn't seem as controlled as you hear it. But it was the mindset of the people. Like, they just believed.
Absolutely. I mean, what you've just put your finger on is the fundamental playbook of dictatorships, these old school dictatorships, where they really control through fear. But they do have a monopoly on force. Now, for years, the Burmese military was like reported to have, you know, massive defections and unhappiness, because the Burmese army itself is ruled through fear. So, you know, it's not very pleasant to be part of it. Having said that, those who were members of the military had a kind of parallel life and a parallel system, different schooling, different housing, different hospital services. You know, so there were benefits to it. But what you refer to as well, of these kind of effectively like backward, like rusty weaponry.
Yeah.
Yes and no. But if you know, to still face off against the barrel of a gun takes a different level of courage than it does to sort of tweet. You know, like it does, like, you know, and not face.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, no, but you know, and I say that, I don't mean to sound flippant. I remember I would go into Burma, and I had begun at this stage, I think, from that first trip. There's a guy, I went in that first trip really just to, you know, see how, you know, just to document the humanitarian disaster. But inevitably, the question that raised is, what is the junta doing to make this such a humanitarian disaster? And neighboring Bangladesh, as I said, is on the border, like, had faced similar storms and similar cyclones, but with far, far lower lethal, rates of death as a result. And it's not exactly one of the, you know, the richest countries in the world either. So governments have a lot to do, obviously, with the death toll. And so I had begun to sort of really start to explore in that first trip, and it became then the subject of my book, you know, this underground democracy movement that was doing exactly what you're saying you would imagine in North Korea, maybe, you know, people standing up and resisting. And I started to read a lot of literature on this. And, you know, the truth is that the Burmese had also, and they were the first to tell me, had been brainwashed for years. Now, the difference between Burma and North Korea, South Korea is an extraordinary example of leapfrogging forward. Burma, under British colonial rule, and then shortly after, was considered as the highest social mobility in Southeast Asia. It had the greatest university east of Oxford. Effectively, it was the intellectual capacity of the people was really kind of considered to be a sign that not only that, combined with the fact they'd once been the rice bowl of the world and extraordinary natural resources, they really had an opportunity to develop intellectually, and, you know, and therefore, because they tasted a few years of sort of parliamentary democracy, that they had a kind of a deeper intellectual foundation for resisting what would ultimately be the sort of military dictatorship. And I say that because one of the things that the dictatorship had done over 50 years, first under General Ne Win and then under junta from 1988 onward, was that they deliberately destroyed the university system, deliberately destroyed the schooling, so that schooling was just appalling. And, you know, so it's the combination of, but then, yeah, of course, like when these dictatorships are really quite flimsy, and that's why they can last for a very long time. But when they topple, like the statue's gone and then everything's chaos and boom, they're gone. Because they are sort of paper thin. And the great one of the great thinkers on how to resist a dictatorship was an academic called Gene Sharp, who I talked to and interviewed in the course of researching all of this and spending time with dissidents in Burma. He developed a lot of his ideas on the border between Burma and Thailand, but also helped the Burmese and many, many other democracy movements around the world analyze and think about this very thing that you mentioned, Matt, in North Korea, which is that he showed through long historical accounts and analyzing all the data, the surest way to overturn a dictatorship or a strong man or whatever is actually not through military force, and not because that's the more moral position, although it happens to like have that nice side thing, which gets international support. It's that the one thing any dictatorship will have is they will have the monopoly of brute force. So even if you're talking about 12-year-olds with rusty guns, plus a 12-year-old who's drugged up on something with a rusty gun, like you don't want to be in front of that when they kind of
you don't
crazy.
Want to be there. No.
Yeah, and very trigger happy that but what you instead need to do is dictators, nonetheless, they need to still run a country. They still need to kind of keep the trains running, or keep their own. They have civil servants. They have lots of other pillars of support. So you have to try to shake those pillars of support and show people a different vision of tomorrow. And a lot of the Burmese ideas, the dissident movement that emerged from 1962, this first coup, but then after a mass uprising that was put down in 1988, and then a political movement that was formed out of that, were these ideas that they kind of developed themselves, that they would try and resist dictatorship through sort of deep non-violence defiance, in that sense of like trying to educate the people how to stand up to these ideas. And actually it gets to, I'm being very long-winded, I apologize, but the book I wrote about this democracy movement really centers on three characters, two young men and one older man, who effectively taught me that as dissidents, I watched them do this. What it really meant was they were going out into the rural villages or the slums or late at night in the tea shops of Rangoon and just helping people articulate their moral outrage, help them find the words for it, using what they, critical thinking is the word that they use, but also helping them understand words very secretly and quietly, because to use words like democracy and freedom and I don't know, even words like nightmare were forbidden. Literally says like rockers would use nightmare in their underground songs, because it
really like the words that weren't allowed to be said. Like this is George Orwell.
Yeah, I really
like they took them out of their vocabulary.
Yeah, you could be. I mean, as usual in these kinds of environments, and in that one particularly, I mean, in the computers didn't work very well. Technology was very backward, so who knew who was following what? But you could be very arbitrarily thrown in prison for something, and then have a trial on a completely trumped up charge. And I mean, I knew young dissidents from an organization called Generation Wave, Mo Shui, a young sort of rocker and rapper. He they would tell me, of course, they would sort of circulate these music that was very allegorical, and hundreds of newspapers you would see on the streets of Burma or Rangoon. So despite the junta's efforts to destroy literacy and thought, I was so overwhelmed by people's intelligence and especially their ability to read between the lines. And one of my dear sources there was an extraordinary journalist, and I would say to him, he would feed me information and he would feed other foreign journalists who would come through, and of course his own paper, he could barely cover what was going on. And I'd say, doesn't it frustrate you that you're like telling me these ideas? He's like, well, no, because this is how we have to operate. Meanwhile, we'll publish poetry, we'll do things that try to get through the censors, but, it doesn't always, and there's a lot of self-censorship as a result. So there are multiple layers of how do you begin to resist. And I think from what I know of North Korea, they haven't been able to do that, in part because they've had an even more severe government. And maybe there is an underground resistance. And the truth is, this is what I figured out very quickly on my beat, as it were. I made this my beat. I was told when I first went to Burma, Myanmar, even by my editors who were more worried about my safety, and they're like, don't worry about the political story, just get that humanitarian story, get out, and you'll be good. But the experts, the Burma experts who were outside the country, who sort of talked to each other, and some of them did extraordinary work. And I didn't mean to, they told me there was no democracy movement. Aung San Suu Kyi had been in under house arrest for years, languishing. Everyone else who had been in her movement were sort of scattered in these different prisons. Forget it; it was dead. And I actually noticed something fundamentally different. I noticed that, 7-8 months after this revolution, this African revolution, this uprising, whatever you want to call it, people were organizing, defying the junta. They weren't allowed to go down to the storm-hit towns in the rice paddies, which had been decimated. They weren't allowed to meet in more than groups of 5. So they would use other ways. They would meet under cover of Buddhist meetings, and that doctors and lawyers from Rangoon and housewives and people who had absolutely nothing, because people really lived hand to mouth, would do everything they could to gather together to give humanitarian aid, and in the process were some quietly networking. And little by little I realized there were dissidents over the border, and I really wanted to meet the real political activists who wouldn't be afraid to tell me up front, who I wouldn't have to use that circuitous language of, is it, your country is so poor. These are people that would tell me, well, here's what's going on in the junta, this play or that play. And that's what I discovered little by little. And it's because of the nature of the regime. Obviously, they're not obviously visible. And you have a few famous dissidents who are over the border who could talk on, but who are never really taken too seriously somehow by the diaspora or by foreign, because that they're not in the country. So how do you know? So I always wonder when I see a lot of these like closed and repressive countries, wonderful books are often written about them from people on the inside. But the truth is, when you're told nothing's going on, it's not about just people pouring into the streets. Like Iran, I know because it's been written in Iran on dissidents in Iran, but that there's a kind of, people are not idiots. And even the Burmese who are uneducated in ideas of democracy, it doesn't take a degree from a fancy Western university to know that sticking a poster on the wall and getting stuck in jail for 7 years for it, something is off.
Something is off.
Yeah.
There's a quote in your book that I really, really liked. You refer to them, because your book comes across like you fell in love with the people. You fell in love with, this is my perception. Yeah. You fell in love with the people. You fell in love with their drive, their belief that they're going to do what they know is right, to push back as they can, even if they don't know that it's going to affect change.
Yeah.
We're going to do this because it's what we have to do. This a quote I heard from someone else. I don't know if doing something is going to help, but I know that doing nothing is not going to help.
Yeah.
But the way you say it, you described it, the skittishness of stalked prey, the sweet spot between paranoia and healthy self-protection.
Well,
your words, but I was like, that was like, that kind of jumped out. I'm like, that, I don't know, like that gave me like a really visual picture of the underground, the coffee shops, the wherever it was, the tea rooms that people met in, that we have to do something.
Yeah, I know you're absolutely. And first of all, about falling in love with Burma and the people, I'm not alone in that. Every single person I knew who went in there, there were also package tours, by the way, like in North Korea. Those were very controlled trips to the beautiful site. But so people from that, but also, freelance gold diggers who would find their ways in, or people working for humanitarian reasons. Every single person I ever met who landed in Burma, even in these really tragic moments, walked away with it heartbroken, because aside from the extraordinary repression, and that there is a natural beauty to that country and a warmth to the people, and a spirituality that is extraordinary. There are pagodas everywhere, and everyone becomes a Buddhist monk, or there are lots of other minorities, Christians and the Chan, the Karen, the Kachin, the Wa, the Arakan, there are lots of Muslims, lots of Hindus. There's something really beautiful, and I cannot tell you the hospitality that is a sort of place, and I've discovered this actually in various other places through my work, that I could show up as the overfed, too moisturized Westerner, you accustomed to everything. And it's the one time they'll switch on their their fan that clearly hasn't been used for 3 years, and they'll take out all the food they have and share it with you. And that,
no, just on that, the juxtaposition. Do you know what they did with our little naive group in South Korea or North Korea?
What did they do?
We got there, we went hiking. The hiking in the mountains, in Korea in general, in South Korea, it's a very common activity for families on weekends. You see, grandmothers to babies and everyone in between going on hikes. But the mountains in North Korea are absolutely gorgeous. I just recently found some of my photos there. We went on a 7-hour hike. The next day, we went to this beautiful restaurant on the top floor of our hotel.
Yeah.
And on the last day we were there, we went out on a banana boat. picture, those big yellow blow up things?
Yeah.
There was like 12 of us on the banana boat at the beach going around like life is wonderful, We actually flipped the banana boat, ended up, and this little dinghy had to come and, help us. We were never really in any danger.
Yeah.
But like we played volleyball on the beach. We did all of this. And then you'd look to your right and there's like barbed wire fences all around the beach. Like I bet you we were the only, often like other groups like ours of the tourism, we're the only ones who got to use those beaches.
Yeah.
Because when you're on the bus going from the border to the hotel and the hiking trails in between, if you look out on the side of the road, like pretty barren. And if you did, like, I remember just seeing people collecting water out of, I don't know what you call it, like a gully on the side of the road. And like, I'm like, that water looks black. Like, I wouldn't drink that. But in our hotel, we had beautiful. And I had an advantage there too, because I went by myself. With the group, but I didn't know anyone else in the tour group. So they paired you up with someone. And the girl that I got paired up with to share a hotel room with was from Toronto, but her parents are Korean. So she spoke the language. She spoke Hangul. So I probably drove her crazy, but I'd always be like, what are they saying? What are they saying? And because when you're coming through the border, there's this music that goes on over and over again. And I'm like, what does this song say? And she's like, well, they're just repeating. It's like to the rhythm of It's a Small World After All. But it's like, who are you? Where do you come from? Who are you? Where do you come from? And it would have been like in a movie, like really weird cinematography, because your vision is a child with a gun going through your bag.
Yeah.
The music, you feel like you're at Disney World.
Yeah.
And then when you leave the border to go and get back on the bus to go to the hotel, there's a guy dressed up in a big bear costume, again, like you're at Disney World, doing kind of like the Queen's wave. And as you leave, and I'm like, what the fuck is this? Like, what the hell? What is going on?
It sounds so crazy. Actually, that sounds...
It's so crazy.
Yeah, but you mentioned so many things, and I want to get back to the question you asked about courage, which I didn't address, that we just are doing what we got to do.
Sure.
But on that, yeah, the natural... Yeah, one of the sad side benefits of having a horrible dictatorship that doesn't develop the country at all is that there's, between the Koreas, the same as DMZ is supposed to be just magnificently beautiful jungle. There's like natural...
Gorgeous.
They hadn't managed to wreck because these countries are so isolated economically. They don't have much cash to destroy it. Now, where they do destroy it, like in Burma, Rangoon, and I didn't mention like Burma, which had been part of the Raj, the Indian Empire, for a while. It had some of the most extraordinary colonial architecture, combined with this just beautiful Burmese huts made of bamboo, which of course are very poor, and but from far away, they look like watercolors in this landscape of just, and pagodas everywhere that date back centuries, that are all gilded in gold because people spent all their money on gilding gold in honor of a spiritual tribute. But where the government did build things, where the judges did build things, they built this new capital in part because they were afraid of the masses in Rangoon who had risen up multiple times, this kind of big, beautiful, ancient city with lots of winding roads. They built a new city in the middle of the country called Naypyidaw, which you visit. It's like 8-lane highways. And how I imagine it was built with North Korean help, actually. It's just cookie cutter, shiny, just these awful kind of mansion gilded buildings that look like they could collapse, and then just soulless as can be. And that, that's what they would do to the whole country if they had a chance.
Are they trying to portray like, oh, no, we're good here. Our people are well taken care of. It's like they want to give this vision to the rest of the world. You don't have to worry about it. Like, we're taking care of it, or they don't care.
It's two things. Whenever they build something, it's a kind of Potemkin thing. But who are they showing it to? Anyway, the reason they have 8-lane highways there is actually for tanks. That has actually happened in the more recent coup of February 2021, by which point the democracy movement that I was writing about were in government and were working together with them, and in a very weird transitional government that they then established, where the country began to open up. But they immediately took advantage of these huge highways and very few people who weren't actually in politics living in this bizarre artificial city that had been created from nothing. to like, send the tanks in, literally. I mean, it was an old school like dictatorship coup, and it just gives them a chance to get out.
Yeah.
Because one of the main things of like, as we see it with any I keep using the word dictator, strong man, tyrant, the more they stay in power, the more they surround themselves with a bubble and they're paranoid. You remember that photo of Putin sitting at the end of a very long table in COVID, they know that everyone like wants to kill them. They don't trust anyone, and so Naypyidaw was really a way of getting away from the hordes of people who they'd repeatedly never been able to stop from rising up against them. But on that other thing, can I get back to that question of courage? You mentioned that they were just doing what they want to do. Yeah. What's so striking, and yet in a way it's not striking, is when you meet people who are in kind of living in the present and knowing that they have to do something. They have passion in what they do. But yes, the word I would repeatedly, the line I sort of repeatedly hear, and the young man I call Nigel in the book, who is actually in prison again now, very charismatic. I remember him saying to me once, we're just doing what we got to do, like that, like shrugging their shoulders. Now, but there were massive sacrifices that those that were really doing this had to take. Like if you had a family and kids and they weren't also engaged in what they call politics, in other words, opposition to the junta directly, you would be putting them at risk. So a lot of people, so the young people in the underground, in the democracy movement, affiliated with the main party of Aung San Suu Kyi, National League for Democracy, or little offshoots around it, they knew that they couldn't really get in relationships, that they couldn't really start a life, that they couldn't, because they would be putting other people in danger, because of course they would be pressured, or those people would be rounded up, or then they couldn't make much money doing this, if any. So the young man who I call, like, who's the titular rebel in my book, I mean, he was kind of a complete, a loner. Yeah, Nui is a loner. I mean, he finds I'm not going to give away the ending, but that they really, they really had to be careful for other people's sake, and they were aware of this. So those who, and actually his best friend, who had been a more passionate democracy activist than him, like when they were both young youth members of Aung San Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy, he fell in love with a young Muslim girl and married her. And he with his heart broken, left politics, because he just didn't, he chose family life. He still worked in humanitarian stuff. But to this day, I talked to him, and he felt like he sacrificed for his, for working for his country. But the other thing is, this is an intergenerational movement where these young people that I was writing about, I show up in 2008, they'd basically begun resisting military rule since 1962, and then 1988 was this massive uprising, and then they saw themselves as a generation. And Nui, the main character of the book, his dad was a political activist and died in prison under mysterious circumstances. He was also a country doctor, and Nui knew this. He was very young when that happened, and chose nonetheless to go into this and to give up a career that he might have been a doctor himself, but gave it up, confronted with the junta, told to sign a paper at one point with agents of the junta that he either give up his medical, his political career and continue with medicine, or give up university. And he, without thinking, gave up university and decided to dedicate himself full time to the democracy movement. But young, and something I think also about their faith and Buddhism and the sort of belief that you're only here for a short time, and then your consciousness is recycled. I gave them a kind of humility as well. They had an extraordinary modesty, all of the young people, and all of the people I talked to, which is why I've never heard of any of them. They aside from that, they have very complicated names. But
I mean, if someone wants to hear, so I know where I got your book. I got your book from you, Rebel of Rangoon, but I imagine you can pick it up anywhere.
It's available on Amazon, I think, is the best way to get it these days. It was printed in 2015. So yeah, okay. You can get it in its Burmese Samizdat edition if you feel like going to visit Burma or the environs. Like it's
honestly, I kind of do now.
Yeah, I let it be translated secretly by what had been like a clandestine bookshop, and since their recent coup a couple of years ago, I noticed it was selling very well in its Burmese version, because it's about them, and they'd have been so brutally suppressed.
I could listen to you talk about Burma and the mindset of the people all day. And I'm going to be in town the first week of September if you're around.
Oh, wow. Cool. Yeah.
Yeah. So we can talk more.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, when we went out for dinner last, you were writing about the jail system in Honduras?
Well, so I'm doing the reverse there, actually. So when I moved to Mexico to cover Mexico, Central America for a press agency called Reuters, I'm independent from them now. I was covering Mexico, Central America. I was really covering a lot of immigration. And at the time, listeners recall, there were like huge waves of caravans of Central Americans heading to the US. This was under the Trump administration.
Yeah, I remember.
And I would be walking for days upon days with these people, most of whom were coming from Honduras, one of these troubled countries in what's called the Northern Triangle of Central America, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, fleeing gangs, poverty, corruption. I'd write these in my dispatches in a one-line, throwaway. And I started to map where people were fleeing, because it was just frustrating to like write these, short, not really understanding, also hearing on the other end, people say, well, why are they coming? Oh, they're all cheating. They're all economic migrants. They're all lying about wanting asylum. And it was not true, having seen the fear that I had seen, say, in Burma that we discussed in the North Korean context.
Yeah.
I had rarely seen the fear that I saw from people, when I went to Central America, to Honduras, to these places where people are so afraid, because at least in a dictatorship, you know who the enemy is. In a country that is nominally a democracy, but is so brutally corrupt and overrun with an alphabet soup of criminal organizations, gangs, but also narcos who are in government, and you don't really know who the enemy is. You don't have the judges on the payroll. In Spanish, there's a word, sicariato, which doesn't really have a translation. It's the noun. It's the noun for contract killing. There's an industry of contract killing. It's dirt cheap to kill people. So I started to, so I'm working on a book now that's kind of the reverse of this first one, which is how you can like have the courage effectively to stand up to authoritarian rule and defy it, and go against the current in that sense, because it's about people who did that. This is the other way around. This is how the best and the brightest in a society can be. In a society that is so broken, they end up choosing to be contract killers at age 10 or 11. How a society can be so broken, it just makes it incredibly difficult for reformers. There are plenty to really make headway in reforming, different security units in the police, or if you're born in the wrong slum and bad barrio, like it just makes sense to join the gang that's more in control than the police, who are absent or you don't trust them. So it's the story in this case of a young man who I met when he was just about to turn 18, and he was desperately trying to leave MS-13, which is, you might have heard about in the US context, one of these two very famous transnational gangs, MS-13 and Barrio 18, these Central American gangs that are effectively, they control the barrio. They started out as sort of tattooed thugs who would extort locals. In the Honduran context, over several generations, they've become much bigger than that. They're a criminal organization involved in trafficking drugs, working with the cartels and narco traffickers who work at a higher level, because to transport shipments of cocaine and vast amounts of drugs, you need to get under the radar. So you need planes, you need generals on the, anyway, so it's the story of this young man who was definitely trying to leave MS-13 when I met him, and I followed him for like 4 years as he tried to lead an honest life, and just the impossibility of doing that. And jails come into it, because I don't want to give away the ending. But I've been in many jails in Honduras, and it's a tough, nasty place. I went into jail in Burma, but for a different reason. I broke into it where I managed to smuggle a former political prisoner, extraordinarily just smuggled me into a political prison. Didn't really break in.
You broke into the jail in Burma?
Well, he took me into insane prison, which is like the famous prison where the political prisoners are. I did get totally inside, but I would never have been allowed as a foreigner, and I just dressed up as a Burmese girl, and he kind of took me in, and it was just a good chance to see. In Honduras, when I've been into prisons, there are the odd person who's in there for like, most people have never been put on trial. You're like, isn't that like 80% of them, or like more than half, are like languishing for years.
80% in there, no trial.
No, I'm making that statistic up. I'm sorry, but it is a shocking number.
But no, but like a huge percentage.
Yeah, huge.
And they're trials mañana, right?
Yeah, and some of them are in there, like, and they're minors, and they shouldn't be. I mean, just a complete mishmash. But there really is a criminality problem there. So you have these different modules where, like, literally like cages. They're separated like zoo animals, because you have regular massacres inside these prisons, where the Barrio 18 people will kill the MS-13 people, and then the 7 other bandas, the Olenchanos, and then this and that. They're all enemies with each other, and it's a brutal world. It's very dog eats dog. And so the young man I was following, I mean, what struck me about him is that he did terrible things, and be the first to admit it. within the rules of war of his organization. It was just fascinating to see someone who was a really good, really complex, solid human being, absolutely brilliant in his way, get pulled into that. I've met psychopaths, and it turns, you can turn you into a psychopath to be first. So it's and I know his whole family, and so this is their kind of saga. It's kind of Les Miserables in the Banana Republic, and it's an attempt to show to North Americans basically, it's not all a lie when they say that some of them are fleeing the asylum. Yeah, there's a real terrible, terrible fear that they face in these countries.
Well, because didn't you tell me this kid who's say the main subject of your book you're working on now, like his first murder was like 8 or 10 years old, like a child.
Yeah, he was 10.
Like he was really young. He was 10.
Exactly. So so
like at 10, I would have done whatever you're brought into it because you need security. You need to belong to some place. So you don't know who you are when you're 10.
Right. Although he's quite wise and advanced for his years, and he has very but no, absolutely. That I mean, a lot, or often you hear that they're all forcibly recruited. Some are, but there's a kind of coercion that happens. So in his case, by the time he was 10 and a couple of age, he was, for the gangs, he was living in one of the most murderous barriers of the most murderous city of the most murderous country in the world, which is effectively, and the rates of that, by political science definitions, the rates of homicides of the ones that are registered and known, because by the way, in Latin America, there's something called the cifra negra, the black figure where no one reports, dead bodies. And,
of course.
Disappear.
Yeah.
So of the ones we know, it was higher than the threshold definition of deaths in a civil war, effectively. So effectively, you've had undeclared civil wars between, different gangs fighting each other, whatever is going on. And so he was born into that, and the concentration of streets he lived in were controlled at that point by MS-13. And he was the eldest. They all kind of fit a bit of a textbook profile of the young men of the gang that I've met. They come from broken families, very destitute. The gangs kind of search out the right kind of family. And he was the eldest, born. His mother had him when she was 16. His father had abandoned them when his mother was pregnant. His mother goes on to have many more children, and he grew up very, very poor, and seeing that his little brothers and sisters who he loved were not fed enough, and the gang down the road, and he was very smart, but mother working very, very hard, and no means he wanted to go out and help. He was already working from dawn till dusk 5 days a week on a bus, as a bus assistant, which is a little cheap, but you can join a gang, and as a 10-year-old, of course, guns, you can hallucinate about that as their toys, and the gangs have a very smart way of luring you in with brotherhood and love, and they'll feed you a little bit of food, and give you fresh shoes, and you see these cool dudes down the road who look clean and smart, and MS-13 surprisingly is actually they have very clear codes, they control the streets and the barriers that they control in Honduras so well that if someone is raped or there's a robbery, they will be the ones to police it and shoot their own. I mean, most of the people that died that he had initially entered the gang with, he probably were I shouldn't laugh. Sorry, then it's not funny at all. They were killed because of executions of their own. So that they were for stealing. So they kept law and order in a way. And then, in fact, his mother recently, she thought a sicario was following her for various reasons, and she said, she reached out to the MS-13 guy down the road. Saying, was it one of yours? He's going, no, madam, not at all. But let me give you my number, and I'll let you know. And whereas the renegade delinquent criminals, just do their own thing, get away with it. But it's a nasty world. So when he was 10 years old, and very quickly
disordered order,
and there's a ranking in it. I mean, it's very much like an army. MS-13 particularly, they have a you start by selling their banderas, or you're first on this. You're put on the sort of street corners to be the lookout. So if you see young men in a bad barrier, if you happen to walk into one in Central America, sitting on a street corner looking at you, kind of hard, they're a bandera. I can't, for instance, you talk about the difficulties of reporting in Burma. The truth is, reporting in these kind of slump, these bad barriers of these countries, you have to also be very careful for people's sake. You can't just walk in because the gangs control it. You go in with a car, and they turn that, they open their windows and show who you are. You have to know where you're going. So you go from bandera lookout to selling drugs, and he was quickly fast tracked to being a sicario, a killer, and he got paid a regular salary and a big salary, so he gets to give half of it to his mother, and at 10, 11, 12, you start to, then very quickly, I mean, he got arrested and he was put in, juvenile prison and rose up the ranks very quickly. And from even there, from inside, he built up MS-13, but something in him snapped and he started to feel this deep, deep emptiness. And one night, and it's kind of the beginning of my book, so it's too bad to say it, he broke down and started weeping and weeping, and he had to desert them. And to desert, again, is like deserting an army. You're going to get shot, you're going to get killed. I mean, there were only two ways out, death or the church.
You don't leave them off, that kind of thing, right? Once you're in, you're in.
Yeah, and at that point, he had many enemies in the opposite gang. He was well known. They all have aliases. His was El Diablito, the little devil.
Did you think El Gabito?
El Diablito, the little devil.
El Diablito.
El Diablito.
So I heard my dog's name.
Yeah. No, not Gabby. The Gabby. No, they have names like El Puel. Psych. I interviewed a sort of active sicario called Psycho, and boy was he, a scary dude. So yeah, and it's been a tough road for him, a very tough road, very tragic.
When do I get to read it?
Well, I am writing it now. I haven't been back. I
knew that was that's the original question.
Yeah,
Soon.
I think
Mañana.
I hope. I mean, I've done all the research. It's actually a question of just. And I also find that, and I had this in my first one too, but the chapters will be shorter in this one, by the way. I think it'll be also because I'm trying to capture that kind of ambiance. The first one was I was capturing the ambiance of sort of, Burmese Buddhist environment.
Yeah.
And I'd like to become a better, older writer, more wise and like less long sentences and all this stuff that I have a tendency to do with my British cultural background and reading too many 19th century novels. But so soon, I hope. But yeah, it's a narrative. I do very immersive journalism, as you can hear, where I spend a lot of time with people as much as I can. So I can write like a fly on the wall and tell the story like I'm writing a novel. So I'm writing from inside these characters. So I've recorded a huge amount of stuff. And what's shocking with Honduras, it's a tiny country of 9 million people. The former president just got, put in prison in the US, in New York for life for narco trafficking, and he was supposedly one of the US's best allies against narco trafficking, and it was an open secret that his own family was involved in it. And my point is, as I go back through even my first interviews, I can connect all the dots. Like my friend, I'll call him David because that's what I call him in the book, this contract killer, his boss was one of 4 people who are now most wanted by the FBI who worked with this. They all connect. So trying to put all those pieces together to tell a story that's very granular, very human, I hope, but also, is connected to the highest of the high people in the country is a bit of a puzzle. It's like putting together a puzzle in a way, so.
I can't even imagine. How do you write a book? Like you take, what did you say, 63 notebooks?
I think you have a very obsessive, crazy mind where I looked up my first book and I'm like, everyone around me married, had kids, and I did. It takes a kind of weird doggedness, I think, and just a fascination to try to understand. And yeah, through that, this kind of compulsion. I just feel compelled to tell these people's stories in the way that they deserve. And then when I lose, because the ego gets in the way, and you lose a sense of who's going to read this, like 3 people, and what is it? And then I go back and I listen, because now I record everything and I hear in their voice something, and it just. Everyone has an incredible story. You, Angela, of course, have an incredible story. Everyone is the hero of their own story. The question is, if you're witness, as I have been, to sort of people who really have these fascinating stories that are untold, it's just, then how do I tell it? I spend enough time with people that I like to, I get myself out of the way and I just tell it from there. This one is a very plot-driven story. It follows, it begins, usually the prologue begins with him, his first. Is he going to shoot this guy? Is he not? And it's recreating that, and then it gets eventually to the things I was able to even witness myself. But otherwise, I'm telling it from the point of view of the different characters. The judge, the pastor, the this and that, but mainly from his mother, his grandmother, and other characters like a forensic scientist. So it's how to tell it. I don't know. I read a lot of great authors to try to learn from them.
Yeah, I know your apartment is like a library.
Indeed.
Yeah, but I'm excited to read it. Because you say I might have a great story. We met at a dog park, not at a prison. So my story is a little bit less.
Well, that's a kind of prison for dogs, isn't it?
You kidding? Look how happy those dogs were. Gabe loved that dog park. Ninja loves that dog park.
Well, she did learn to jump over. And by the way, I called her Ninja after trips on there. So I'm like, I need love. And I adopted my dog in Ninja or something.
What, she jumped over from the side for the big dogs to the side for the little dogs?
She just jumped over. She learned to like jump over. She doesn't like it. Like, she's little, you know. She's.
We had to put screens on our windows here 2 weeks ago because Gabe figured out how to jump out the window because. From my front window, you can see like the beach. So he's like, no, I want to be there. Wow. So he actually jumped out the window. I'm like, where's my dog?
See, dogs have a sense of freedom that humans have kind of denied themselves. They just need.
Yeah, when I saw him do it, I was like, did that just, he's so funny.
That's so cute.
I'm back in town. I think the 1st to the 8th. If you're around September, if you're around.
I never know what I'm going to be doing, but absolutely.
You never know.
Get in touch.
But if you are, yeah.
For sure.
Unfortunately, Gabe will not be with me, so I'm going to have to use Ninja as my +1 at the dog park.
With pleasure.
But maybe we can go back, we can hit up that cafe again. Because I want to hear more of how everything's going.
Oh my God, you're so kind. Thank you so much for letting me ramble. And I apologize if I'm very long-winded.
What you do is incredible. And I don't think it would be possible to do it without being obsessed.
Yeah, there isn't much money in it either. So,
well, let us know where we can find all your books, and maybe we can help that.
Well, this is number 2. So in between, I try to work for actual publications and write for them like shorter pieces. Get more.
But this is your passion, the books.
Yeah. Or I think I think some of these stories. That first book grew out of like an 800 word, or it wasn't initially an 800 word piece. It was going to be a proper article on. And it was like cut down to like just like 4 paragraphs, and it was so unsatisfying. I'm like, there's so much more to tell. So
the book is so good. The book is so good.
Thank you so much, Angela, for inviting me on.